I call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to the committee rules 5F and the House Rules 11-2H4, the chair may postpone further proceedings today. All right, settle down. Shh. You've heard this before, but I must read it. Where was I? Further proceedings today on any question approving any measure or matter adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 66, the Route 66 Centennial Commission Act, General Services Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Program Resolutions, H.R. 6194, the Real Reform Act of 2018, H.R. 5846, the Promoting Flood Risk Mitigation Act, H.R. 5772 to designate the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Courthouse in Amarillo, Texas, as the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Mary Lou Robinson United States Courthouse. H.R. 3460 to designate the United States Courthouse located at 323 East Chapel Hill Street in Durham, North Carolina, as the John Hervey Wheeler United States Courthouse. H.R. 6175, the Maritime Safety Act of 2018. H.R. 6206, the Coast Guard Blue Technology Center of Expertise Act. And S. 756, the Save Our Seas Act of 2017. And H.R. 3906, the Innovative Stormwater Infrastructure Act of 2017. Our first item to consider is H.R. 66, the Route 66 Centennial Commission Act. I ask for unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Highways and Transit and call up H.R. 66 and that be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank Mr. Davis and Mr. Napolitano for their work on this legislation. This bipartisan bill would establish a framework to commemorate and preserve Route 66, one of the most famous highways in our nation's history and in the world. I urge all members to support H.R. 66. I now recognize Mr. Graves of Missouri to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 66, as you pointed out, establishes the Route 66 Centennial Commission. The commission is going to study and make recommendations to Congress on how best to commemorate Route 66 on the occasion of its 100th anniversary in 2026. In addition, the bill would direct the commission to host a conference on the U.S. numbered highway system. Finally, H.R. 66 would require the Secretary of Transportation, along with certain governors, to prepare a plan on the preservation needs of Route 66. I'd urge my colleagues to support H.R. 66, and with that, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now recognize Mr. Fazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly fully support this, an incredibly historic route. I've driven remaining portions of it, and we should certainly put together a excellent celebration. And with that, I would yield time to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Napolitano.
I thank gentlemen for yielding. And thank you, Mr. Schuster, Mr. Grace, the ranking members DeFazio and Norton for marking up the Route 66 Centennial Commission Act. I thank my colleague, Representative Davis, for introducing this legislation with me. It runs east to west through my district as Foothill Boulevard and Huntington Drive in the cities of Laverne, San Dimas, Azusa, Duarte, and Monrovia. Our local restaurants, shops, businesses like so many of the interstate, from the heartland to the West Coast, provide rest breaks for travelers, allowing them to sample the local flavors through our communities that are proud to be connected by the iconic road. The city of Duarte already celebrates Route 66 every year in September with a parade of classic cars, equestrian groups, and marching bands. Has memorabilia and is very proud by marking the road with the Route 66 logo. The theme of the Los Angeles County Fair in Los Angeles this year is Route 66 with memorabilia and Route 66 theme movie rights. States and local governments across the country are reinvesting in Route 66 as an icon of American history and culture. The federal government should be involved in the effort as well. It creates a national commission to recommend activities to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Route 66 in 2026. And as pointed out, the Department of Transportation requires to develop a plan on preservation of Route 66, excuse me, required to consult with 8 states through which it goes through California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois. We've outreached to all the states to get them involved, and I urge my colleagues to support Route 66. Thank the committee for holding the markup, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask all members to support H.R. 66. I'd like to also offer my thanks to my colleague, Ms. Napolitano, for helping to get this bill to the finish line. And thank you to the countless members who have also taken the initiative to support this legislation that will preserve one of our nation's true treasures. During World War II, Route 66 transported troops, equipment, and supplies to military bases across our country and was used after the war by thousands of troops returning home to their families. By the 1950s, Route 66 began to see a rise in tourism and became the true symbol of American freedom and independence we all know today. In April of last year, I went on an extended tour of Illinois' stretch of Route 66 with my good friend Darren LaHood, as well as multiple state and local lawmakers. We got to see the enormous impact the Mother Road brings to Illinois, providing for thousands of jobs and millions in state and local revenue that support our small rural communities. The Centennial of Route 66 will be an international celebration, and the state of Illinois and my district will be ready to welcome travelers from around the world who want to experience the magic of this scenic byway. This legislation will create a 19-member commission to recommend activities to honor the 100th anniversary of Route 66 in the year 2026. My bill also directs the U.S. Department of Transportation to develop a plan to ensure the historic first all-paved U.S. highway connecting the Midwest to California will be preserved for many more centennials to come. In doing this, the Secretary of Transportation will work with the governors of the 8 states that this historic highway passes through to develop a comprehensive preservation plan. H.R. 66 is endorsed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Route 66 Road Ahead Partnership, the National Historic Route 66 Federation, the Auto Club Enterprises, also known as AAA, and also the Route 66 Alliance. Again, I want to thank Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, and Ms. Napolitano, and the committee staff. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Do any of the members wish to be recognized? Mr. LaMalfa?
Oh, thank you. I just want to commend the author, Mr. Graves, and everybody had a hand in this. As a gearhead myself who loves automobilia, and the chance me and my family have had to trace a route from Oklahoma to Southern California, this is indeed an iconic part of American culture, the car culture, what it means going back to people moving west to find better opportunities during the Dust Bowl. It has so much symbolism, and this is a really great effort to make sure we commemorate this 100 years of the Mother Road. So thank you to my colleagues on that. It means a lot.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. Chairman Graves of Missouri is recognized. Is there an amendment at the desk?
Amendments at the desk, Mr. Chairman. I'd ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 39, offered by Mr. Graves.
Mr. Graves is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment makes a change in order that obviously makes it conform to the House cut-go protocols.
Are there any amendments? Do any of the members wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none. Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the questions on the amendment, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? I recognize Mr. Graves of Missouri for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 66 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration are the General Services Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Programs Resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up these resolutions in block. They will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Today we are considering 20 resolutions that will continue Subcommittee Chairman Barletta's work saving the taxpayers money. The work of this subcommittee over the last 5 years has saved the taxpayer more than $3.7 billion. I urge approval of this resolution in block. I recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the resolutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we are considering 20 GSA resolutions, including 14 alterations, 2 leases, 2 construction, and 2 acquisitions. Approving these resolutions will save the taxpayer more than $139 million. In addition, this committee will be approving 3 prospectuses that would construct or expand land ports of entry in Washington, California, and New York. Since becoming subcommittee chairman, we have worked on a bipartisan basis to lower building and leasing costs and ensure efficient space usage. After many hearings and roundtables holding GSA and its tenant agencies accountable, we are seeing that most agencies are finally getting the message. I urge my colleagues to approve the GSA resolutions en bloc. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman and now recognize Ms. Titus for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also support the 20 GSA resolutions that authorize new acquisition, alteration, and leasing actions across the country. And I'm very pleased that the subcommittee chairman has continued to work cooperatively with our side of the aisle. All the resolutions before us continue to include language addressing concerns about receiving timely information on projects from the GSA and/or language prohibiting elected officials from benefiting from leases. In addition, the leases we're considering include critical provisions notifying tenant agencies carrying out sensitive missions if the building is owned by a foreign entity. I look forward to continuing to work with the chairman on this issue and other issues related to GSA, including managing the federal real estate portfolio more efficiently. So I would urge my colleagues to support the approval of all the resolutions. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. I now recognize Chairman Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee. I'm not going to speak to the bill we're talking about right now, but to S756, sponsored by my Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska, with a companion bill of mine, H.R. 2748. This is about plastics in the ocean. I'm on the Ocean Caucus. We need to address this issue very quickly because there's an area in the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas that's plastic. It has to be worked on. And this is just a small step in the right direction. And I'd like to submit for the record my written statement, but I hope all of you recognize that this is probably the #1 problem we have in our oceans today that will affect our fisheries, our coastlines, and more than that, possibly the decline in fisheries because of the invasion of plastic, which are not detergible. Either we have to address our trading partners and encourage them and ourselves, and each individual not to deposit plastics that can be reused. So, Mr. Chairman, I again thank you for bringing that bill up. When it comes up, I do have to leave, and that's why I had taken this time to do it. I do support the bill we're addressing at this time. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman and remind all members that Mr. Young is the Dean of the House. He is finally #1 after all these years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any other members wish to be recognized for statements? We will now consider the resolution for amendment. Recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the 20 committee resolutions be approved en bloc.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The resolutions are approved. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6194, the Real Reform Act of 2018. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management. Call up H.R. 6194, and that it be considered as read and open amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I thank Subcommittee Chairman Barletta for his leadership and work on H.R. 6194, the Real Reform Act of 2018. This bill will take advantage of the current leasing market and give GSA the tools it needs to negotiate better deals for the taxpayer. The bill will also make other critical improvements to the oversight of federal buildings and better manage federal office space. I urge all members to support the bill. I now recognize Subcommittee Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Schuster for working with me to craft the Real Estate Assets and Leasing Reform Act, or the Real Reform Act. Since becoming chairman of the subcommittee, we have held hearings, roundtables, and listening sessions to examine GSA's leased portfolio. Over the next few years, a significant number of GSA leases will expire. More than half of GSA's inventory is in commercial leased space, which costs the taxpayer $5.5 billion each year. That is a significant amount. How we replace these leases will have a major impact on the cost to the taxpayer, which is why this committee must look to pass real reform. Since last Congress, we have worked closely with OMB and GSA to reduce the federal footprint through consolidating space and improving the use of such space. Through these efforts, we have saved the taxpayer more than $3.7 billion. In fact, we are beginning to see the cost curve for GSA's lease space go down. That is no accident. The bipartisan work of this committee has been critical. With a large number of leases expiring in the near future, we now have a ripe opportunity to save even more. To take advantage of this opportunity, the Real Reform Act establishes a leasing pilot program. This pilot program will allow GSA to streamline the leasing process to work through expiring leases more quickly and lock in good deals for the long term. The legislation gives GSA flexible pilot authority to address roadblocks to reducing costs so space acquisition can be based on the best deal and not on arbitrary factors like unusually high ceiling heights that reduce competition. The legislation also includes a provision that will allow GSA to negotiate discounted purchase options. While leases may make sense in some cases, we have seen GSA pay for a building several times over through lease payments without gaining any equity. This doesn't make sense. Having options to purchase will provide GSA with the ability to purchase the best deal for the taxpayer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Barletta. I now recognize Ranking Member DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you. I want to thank the chairman of the subcommittee and the ranking member of the subcommittee. This is a very important legislation, could save the taxpayers a lot of money. And we have acted previously, and unfortunately, the Senate has seen fit to languish on the issue. But hopefully this time we'll get something done. GSA is going to have to justify their space requests. They have to justify whether or not and explain whether or not they looked at co-location consolidation opportunities. They have to clearly compare the cost of leasing versus construction so that we know what's the best deal. It will also give them language that will make it easier for them to insert purchase options into long-term leases instead of perpetually leasing a space. If a lease purchase is a better deal for the taxpayers, that's the route we should go. It's not a perfect bill, but the fact that GSA is looking at a large number of lease expirations in the next few coming years, I think it's critical that they get this reform in place before they come up with a wave of expiring leases. Owning is often the most cost-effective option for federal agencies, but there's always going to be some additional leasing, and the pilot program and the GAO office reports authorized in this bill will provide the committee with much more definitive data about the most efficient way to engage in leasing commercial office space. The interim reports on the pilot program and other authorities will be instructive as to which authorities in today's bill Congress should let expire in 5 years and which we should keep. I expect and hope for vigorous oversight as GSA implements this new program, and will urge that the committee stay engaged in active oversight. With that, I recommend the bill to my colleagues.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In addition to the 5-year pilot program that's been described by the ranking member, there are other provisions of reform in the bill, so I would like to say I, too, support it. The other reform measures are some that were brought forward by the former subcommittee ranking member, Andre Carson. He has tried previously to get this passed, and these are aimed at reforming the Federal Protective Service. Over 20 years ago, on April 19, 1995, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was bombed in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. In the aftermath of that bombing, the Department of Justice assessed the vulnerability of federal office buildings throughout the country, particularly related to acts of terrorism and other forms of violence. They issued a report that made several recommendations, including upgrading the Federal Protective Service and bringing each federal facility up to recommended minimum standards for its security level. Now, 20 years later, finally, the reforms in this legislation are beginning to address those recommendations in a meaningful way. One thing that they do that's very important is include creating a national framework for the 13,000 contract guards who protect federal buildings, employees, and the visitors that go there every day. The bill mandates a minimum level of training for protective service officers while providing authority for those officers to carry firearms and detain suspects accused of a felony on federal property. These reforms will allow us to move the Federal Protective Service forward, in addition to allowing us to direct the GSA to tighten up and reform the leasing process. So I look forward to getting more information in the future and continuing to work across the aisle to improve GAO's operations. And I support this and encourage others to support it, and yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. Now recognizing Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that this bill, a reform bill, includes a section that this committee passed in 2016, and I hope will pass again, to require that breastfeeding mothers be able to do so in federally owned or leased space. My bill would extend this requirement to include not just employees, but visitors and guests to federal employees across the nation, because 30 million visitors come to the nation's capital every year. This is a mecca for tourists, including your own constituents. The Center for Disease Control has made findings that already require employers to provide such space for lactating mothers on the job, but there's no such requirement in all federal and leased space and for visitors to federal facilities. The Center for Disease Control has shown that nursing mothers themselves show some protection to forms of cancer and diabetes, and the children or infants even more so for asthma, diabetes, respiratory infections, and the like. This is already partially federal policy. It is time to make sure that whenever you go into a federal lease facility and are in need of lactating space, that will be available to you. I thank you very much for including this once again in this reform bill. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? We will now consider the bill for amendment. The chairman recognizes Mr. Barletto.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 48, offered by Mr. Barletta.
Mr. Barletto is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus for working with me on this manager's amendment. This amendment reflects bipartisan work on some critical issues. I also want to thank Representative Denham for his leadership on the Federal Asset Sale and Transfer Act enacted in 2016 and for working with us on some important updates to that law. This manager's amendment will ensure the board created in FASTA has time to get up and running to realize the savings from that legislation. The amendment will also strengthen the security of our leased facilities by ensuring high-security agencies know when space they are leasing is owned by a foreign entity. The amendment also ensures existing restrictions in the law with respect to interested parties are incorporated in lease agreements going forward. Finally, the amendment requires GSA to conduct a study and report back to the committee on proposals to mitigate the impact of public buildings on migratory birds. Again, I want to thank Ranking Member Titus for working with me on these changes, and I urge support for the adoption of this amendment.
We recognize Ms. Titus to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the chairman of the subcommittee for working with us. I'm pleased to support the manager's amendment. It codifies two provisions that recently were carried regularly in GSA resolutions, but it makes improvements to them and makes them clearer. It also makes several improvements to other GSA reform bills that we've previously passed in this committee. First, the amendment requires GSA to include a clear prohibition on GSA engaging in lease agreements that benefit the President, the Vice President, and members of Congress in all leases. Previously, GSA has carried a similar provision in their outleases of federal buildings that banned all federally elected officials from benefiting from leases. However, in recent times, there has been some confusion about who is considered an elected official, so now we must explicitly state that the president is an official who should not benefit from GSA leases. I'm pleased that we're removing all doubt that federal officials should not directly benefit from federal leases, regardless of when they were elected to office. Second, I'm pleased that the amendment contains Representative Lynch's bipartisan bill requiring the identification of the beneficial owner of buildings that house high-security space leased for federal agencies. The GAO has identified security risks that may exist to highly sensitive governmental operations if federal tenants don't know that a federal entity or a foreign entity owns and controls the building. This notification of foreign ownership of buildings housing high-security operations simply allows the tenant agency to engage in security mitigation measures meant to reduce the risk of espionage and unauthorized cyber and physical access. These two smart measures improve accountability and security in our federal building. Lastly, I want to thank the chairman for working with me to include provisions related to the construction, acquisition, and refurbishment of our federal buildings, both leased and owned, to examine how we can make these buildings safer for wildlife, especially birds. More and more modern buildings are being constructed with glass facades, and as a result, we've seen over 1 billion birds killed in bird strikes. But there are cost-effective and aesthetically pleasing designs and techniques we can and should be incorporating into our federal building portfolio that causes us to be able to mitigate this dangerous trend. So I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Mike Quigley from Illinois, who's been a champion on these issues and is the author of the Federal Bird Safe Building Act. And I look forward to working on this as the study moves forward. So I would urge all the members to support the manager's amendment. I again thank the chairman and yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize Mr. Denham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Asset and Sale of Transfer Act was signed into law December 2016. It's been a year and a half. We authorized $5 million to set the board up, yet no board members have been appointed. We have no executive director that's been appointed. It's just, there's no excuse for this. We've got to get this done to get rid of unneeded excess properties that are costing taxpayers millions of dollars in maintenance and upkeep. This will put an amendment in place that will keep the program going for 6 years once the board is appointed. But to let the clock run out on something that can save taxpayers millions of dollars and sell off a number of properties that can actually help us to reduce our debt is something we should be moving forward very, very quickly on. I want to thank the ranking member and the chairman for including this in the manager's amendment. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to be? Mr. Carson's recognized.
Chairman, thank you so very much. I want to join my colleagues in supporting H.R. 6194. I'd also like to thank Chairman Barletta and our new subcommittee ranking member, Titus, for including my bill language to reform and modernize FPS. As a former police officer, I know that these provisions to improve the effectiveness of FPS are long overdue. The reforms in today's legislation begin to address those recommendations in a very meaningful way. And, Mr. Chairman, these reforms include creating a national framework for the 13,000 contract guards that are protecting federal buildings, employees, and visitors every day. This bill also requires the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to study whether it has a sufficient amount of law enforcement officers and inspectors necessary to regularly conduct security assessments of federal facilities. I believe it is important that we do everything possible, Mr. Chairman, to protect the millions of federal workers and daily visitors to federal buildings. I hope that we can continue to work together in a bipartisan manner on this committee. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Ms. Plaskett, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer an amendment.
Is there an amendment at the desk?
The amendment is at the desk, yes.
Without Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 79, offered by Ms. Plaskett.
Ms. Plaskett's recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you. I would like to make an amendment to the Federal Buildings Resiliency. My amendment would require the General Service Administration to assess the resilience of its public buildings in disaster-affected areas and to report on plans for restoration of such buildings and the improvement of their adaptability to extreme weather. What this bill, the Real Reform Act, is intended to do is to save money, to conserve public resources that are responsibility of GSA. And that is exactly in line with what this amendment does. Safeguards public resources and seeks measures to improve efficiency. Much of our country was impacted by extreme weather and unprecedented natural disaster. We all saw it on television, and I saw personally the walls and roofs that were blown out of homes, apartment buildings, and facilities from the force of wind alone. Federal buildings were no exception. For example, in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, according to GSA, in the path of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, there were approximately 1.8 million square feet in GSA rentable federal property. In the Virgin Islands, where there are 2 GSA-controlled federal buildings, both were shut down for weeks by the hurricanes, and one of them, the Almeric Christian Federal Building on St. Croix, named, by the way, for your former colleague Donna Christensen's father, suffered extensive damage and could not be reopened until late November, 2 months after the storms. These buildings house and support numerous agencies that serve critically important functions to Americans: Social Security Administration, Veterans Affairs, federal courts, the Department of State Passports Office, etc. These storms are only projected to get worse, and the people in my district want all federal agencies devoted to a strategy to improve on lessons learned in preparedness and resiliency. We applaud the men and women of GSA and their commitment to service. Many reported to work immediately after these storms, despite personal challenges, to perform damage assessments and to help others. This amendment is for their benefit as well as the taxpayer. Better preparation of the buildings and resilience planning will help to reduce major damage from severe weather and save property, jobs, money, and lives. None of us want to see again the type of devastation we've seen this past year, and so we must support better resiliency. I ask for support of my amendment and yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, I wish to say that the gentlelady has a good amendment, and I support the amendment, so hope all members will support the amendment. Are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment's agreed to. I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 6194 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. The bill is amended and is approved in order reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5846, the Promoting Flood Risk Mitigation Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Works, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, and call up H.R. 5846 and be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. H.R. 5846 requires a study of FEMA's buyout mitigation program and a report to Congress. Given how critical this program has been in helping people and get people out of harm's way and reduce disaster costs, a review of the program is appropriate. I urge all my colleagues to support this bill. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
I'd like to thank Ranking Member DeFazio and Congressman Sanford for co-sponsoring this bipartisan legislation. The Promoting Flood Risk Mitigation Act will require the Government Accountability Office to study and provide a report to Congress on FEMA's repetitive flood loss property buyout program. FEMA's buyout program helps communities purchase flood-prone properties, remove the buildings, and maintain the land as open space, ensuring that there are no structures in harm's way that will need federal assistance again in the future. This mitigation measures helps save lives and taxpayer dollars, as well as reduces property damage. We know for every $1 spent on mitigation, $4 to $8 are saved in avoided disaster recovery costs. And historically, the acquisition of repetitively flooded properties is the most cost-beneficial of flood mitigation projects. Relocating such homes and buildings that are repeatedly flooded helps communities avoid damage and losses and recover faster. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5846. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I congratulate the chairman of the subcommittee and the full committee chairman. Again, this is legislation that has potential to help the very endangered flood insurance program and to save taxpayers money in the future. It makes a lot of sense. We need to better encourage people to be bought out rather than repetitively flooded, rebuilt, flooded, rebuilt, flooded, rebuilt. And the chairman mentioned the 4 to 8 times cost-benefit ratio that we get with this. There are a couple of interesting ideas in this which would allow people to actually agree in advance, should their home be destroyed, that they will acquiesce to a market rate buyout by the federal flood insurance program, and therefore they will get a discount on their premiums, which could be an interesting incentive. This would be a pilot program, and we would be able to, again, as we will with the leasing program, exert oversight, monitor the program, and see if it works as we think it will. It'll also examine the role or the potential for nonprofit organizations to be involved in making buyouts more readily available and more efficient. The repetitive rebuilding of structures in very high-risk areas is very expensive and counterproductive. So I will have an amendment to clarify one portion, but otherwise I fully endorse this legislation.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, support H.R. 5846 brought by Mr. Blumenauer from Oregon, as well as the amendments that will be offered by Mr. DeFazio and Mr. Graves. Thank you.
Mr. Sanford is recognized.
Thanks, Chairman. And I just want to commend the bipartisan team that has brought this bill forward. I think it makes common sense. There's that notion of stitch in time saves 9, and this bill certainly prescribes to that simple theory. I think it's telling that the National Resources Defense Council has found that 30,000 homes have been flooded an average of 5 times at great expense to the taxpayer. If you look at the numbers, the National Flood Insurance Program has spent $5.5 billion rebuilding these homes. And this idea of flood it, rebuild it, flood it, rebuild it, flood it, rebuild it, is something that just plain defies common sense. I think it's for that reason that there's such a broad coalition of support behind this, ranging from the realtors to Nature Conservancy to state floodplain managers to the Pew Charitable Trust and more. And it says a lot about the degree of common sense that's indeed built into this bill. And so it's for that reason that I indeed support it, and I admire so much the work that's been done on it. With that, I'd yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. The chairman recognizes Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
You would like to be considered read?
Yes.
Okay. Without objections to order, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 104, offered by Mr. DeFazio.
Mr. DeFazio is recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to 5846, Promoting Flood Risk Mitigation Act, simply clarifies that GAO will study buyouts that are maintained in perpetuity as open space. There was some recent confusion by some guidance that FEMA recently proposed regarding property owners rebuilding on lands purchased with the flood mitigation assistance funds. That obviously would be a stupid idea, and my amendment clarifies that GAO will not look at this type of buyout. Instead, the amendment directs GAO to examine a pilot program with a state or local government will maintain the acquired property only as open space, and I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Do any other members wish to be recognized on the amendment? Are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? The gentleman, before I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, it appears we have two new members on the committee. Would you please introduce the two new members?
I will. We have, this is Kala, who's our 11-year-old, and out for the summer. Stand up. And this is Coco, who's 8. And so they're here for the week, hanging out with us and being very helpful in terms of drafting amendments and writing talking points.
Which one's the dancer?
So this one's a dancer, this one's a gymnast,
Okay.
pianist, and all sorts of
Well,
other things.
welcome, ladies, to the committee. Now, it appears as though we're being overrun by graves. There's 4 of them in here now. That might be problematic, but welcome, ladies.
It's really
with
crazy.
that-
I don't
with
know
that,
how
I
this
re-
keeps happening.
With that, I recognize your father for his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as we've talked several times in this committee, in regard to the flood insurance program, in regard
Gentlemen,
to...
yield, suspend,
Oh, I need, yeah.
designate the amendment?
Yep.
Everybody's
Amendment
having
number
problems with
one-
that today.
Amendment 140, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
Mr. Graves is now recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we've talked often about flood insurance. We've talked about Corps of Engineers program, and just to lay a few things out, the flood insurance program, by some measure, is in effect insolvent, and the efforts to try and look at buyouts as a tool is certainly something that makes sense and is helpful. And I want to thank Mr. Barletta, Ms. Titus, and the other folks who worked on this legislation to promote this idea. But, Mr. Chairman, we have to have a full offense and a full defense. You don't ever have a game where you just have a defense out on the field, and unfortunately, that's what the flood insurance program is. And in fact, in some cases, if buyouts are just reactive, they could be considered just defense as well. An important part of this overall strategy is offense, and the offense that we have right now is the Corps of Engineers in regard to their resiliency mission. Hurricane protection, flood control projects. But, Mr. Chairman, as we all know, the Corps of Engineers has a $100 billion backlog in projects. This Congress and the various administrations that have occurred over the last few decades have asked for about $1 billion a year. I said this before, I'll say it again. $1 billion a year, you have $100 billion in projects, you finish approximately never. And so the Congress has provided other funding. We provided funding through FEMA, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, FEMA, the Hazard Mitigation Program, HUD through the mitigation program we just funded through the Community Development Block Grant, Disaster Recovery Mitigation Program. There are other funds that are out there. So this amendment simply says that GAO should conduct a study looking at other programs that are out there, other dollars that are out there, and see if it makes sense, as Mr. Barletta said a few minutes ago, to invest or to commingle some of these dollars to prioritize projects that have already been vetted by the federal government from a technical perspective, environmental perspective, and in terms of cost to benefit value to taxpayers across the nation. And so this does a study that the GAO would look at using other resources to help complement, to advance this overall mission. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, in the Disaster Reform and Recovery Act, we did have a provision that addressed part of this. It allowed for the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds to also be used to advance a Corps of Engineer project when the state and local government determined that was the priority for the region. Urge adoption of the amendment. Yield back.
Gentlemen, do any other members wish to be recognized on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Are there any other amendments? I now recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5846 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
The question's on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended, approved, and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 5772 to designate the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Courthouse in Amarillo, Texas as the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Mary Lou Robinson United States Courthouse. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management and call up H.R. 5772 and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. H.R. 5772 would designate the Federal Building in Amarillo, Texas to be the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Mary Lou Robinson United States Courthouse. Ms. Robinson has had a long and prominent career as a jurist in the state of Texas, and I recommend that this committee favorably report the bill to the House. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5772 would designate the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Courthouse in Amarillo, Texas, as the J. Marvin Jones Federal Building and Mary Lou Robinson United States Courthouse. Judge Robinson was a legal pioneer, paving the way for women in what was once a male-dominated profession. In 1973, Judge Robinson was appointed Justice of the 7th Court of Appeals in Amarillo, Texas, making her the first female appellate judge in Texas. 4 years later, she was appointed to Chief Justice of the same court. 5 years later, President Carter appointed Robinson to a federal judgeship, making her the second woman to serve as a United States District Judge in Texas. Over 60 years, Judge Robinson was a pioneer, a scholar, and above all, a judge of fairness and integrity. I support naming this federal building and courthouse after her. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ms. Titus for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, support adding the name of Judge Mary Lou Robinson to the federal courthouse in Amarillo. She was a distinguished jurist for over 63 years. In addition to the career steps that she took described by the chairman, I would also point out she received numerous awards throughout her career. She was named one of 100 legal legends by a Texas lawyer. She received the award Outstanding 50-Year Lawyer presented by the Bar Foundation. She was the 2016 Jurist of the Year nominated by the Texas chapters of American Board of Trial Advocates. She was 1973 Texas Woman of the Year named by the Texas Federation of Business and Professional Women. Obviously, she was well respected by all those in the legal profession, her colleagues, and members of the community. She also had a reputation for running a very orderly and efficient courtroom and creating celebrity trials the same way she would create everyday, mundane, two-day civil cases. I think she certainly deserves to have her name added to the courthouse in Amarillo. I believe it's time, and I offer her congratulations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Do any other members wish to be heard? We'll now consider the bill for amendment. Seeing none, I now recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5772 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 3460 to designate the United States Courthouse located at 323 East Chapel Hill Street in Durham, North Carolina, as the John Harvey Wheeler United States Courthouse. I ask unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, call up H.R. 3460, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Wheeler was a civil rights leader in North Carolina and a member of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I had a distinguished career. I recommend that this committee favorably report this bill to the House. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 3460 would designate the United States Courthouse located in Durham, North Carolina as the John Harvey Wheeler United States Courthouse. Mr. Wheeler played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. He was a respected civil rights leader in Durham, North Carolina, successfully litigating school segregation cases in the 1940s. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed Mr. Wheeler to the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where he worked alongside Vice President Johnson in drafting civil rights legislation. Mr. Wheeler also served as president of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, where he was able to continue his work on civil rights issues. I think it is fitting to name the courthouse in Durham after him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank Congressman Butterfield from North Carolina for bringing this to the committee. And I think, too, it is appropriate to name a federal courthouse in Durham the John Harvey Wheeler Federal Courthouse. You've heard the description of Mr. Wheeler's many accomplishments and the contributions he made to his community. He was truly a hero when it came to working to achieve justice for all citizens. So it's fitting that we designate this building in his honor. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, I now recognize Chairman Barletta to...
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 49, offered by Mr. Barletta.
Mr. Barletta is now recognized to explain his amendment.
This amendment is a technical amendment that clarifies that the courthouse is located in a leased facility. I urge support of for the adoption of the amendment.
Do any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, I now recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 3460 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is, as amended, is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6175, the Maritime Safety Act of 2018. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation and call up H.R. 6175, and that it be considered as read and open amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. H.R. 6175, the Maritime Safety Act of 2018, is a maritime safety bill that responds to the sinking of the El Faro in October of 2015. The bill requires the Coast Guard to ensure we will never have another tragedy like that. The bill should assist in preventing future accidents, so I urge all members to support it. Now recognize Chairman Hunter to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As everybody here recalls, the El Faro sank. We lost 33 souls on that day. There was the voice recorder was not, it was found, but it didn't have all the communication. And one of the reasons it went down is because they went into big waves without battening down the hatches, meaning they didn't close their doors on the outside of the ship and it sank. The Coast Guard passed a body when they were trying to find everybody. They actually passed a body in the ocean, and they couldn't pick it up because they were en route to go get the rest of the bodies. So they never recovered that body. So you have one of the largest tragedies in ocean-going history, in modern history, and what this bill does, the first bill out of three, attempts to fix the problems that made it sink, number one, and that led to problems getting the recorder and the ship and the people afterwards. This maritime safety legislation is a product of the Commandant of the Coast Guard's final action memo in response to the devastating sinking of the El Faro. The El Faro sank in October of 2015 during Hurricane Joaquin while en route to Puerto Rico. The loss of this U.S. flag cargo vessel, its 33-member crew, ranks as one of the worst maritime disasters in U.S. history. H.R. 6175 addresses concerns identified after the accident with the goal of reducing the chances of such a tragedy in the future. The importance of timely weather forecasts sounds simple, but the El Faro crew was making decisions based on forecasts that were many hours old, despite significant changes in the forecasted storm trajectory. Going forward, owners, operators, and charterers of vessels will be required to ensure that their vessels have timely weather forecast charts. That's not crazy, but we're doing it now. Vessels and crew will be supplied with emergency safety gear with locator beacons. Right now, there's no locator beacons, none. So if you're floating in the ocean in 2018, you can find your iPhone, but we can't find you. We're going to change that now. The Coast Guard was hindered by the weather in its attempt to rescue the crew. The use of locator beacons should assist the service in locating a vessel and crew in peril more directly than by estimating the movement of the vessel based on the effects of ocean currents and winds. Again, you can look at your phone and get more information than the Coast Guard gets right now if your ship sinks. We're going to change that. The voice recorder, the black box, in a boat, it sank. It sank. We're going to make it float. It's not crazy. It's pretty simple. We're going to make sure the black box that records everything floats. The Coast Guard is required to work with the International Maritime Organization on a number of items to ensure certain safety of life at sea provisions are in effect, including the installation of float-free voyage data recorders that have an integrated emergency position indicating beacon, meaning like I find my iPhone and it floats. Mr. Chairman, no one wants to hear about another accident like the El Faro. The intent of H.R. 6175 is to ensure the best safety measures are in place and appropriate safety equipment is available and in use on U.S. vessels. Industry is supportive of this legislation and in some cases is already working to implement some of the provisions in the bill. I urge members to support the bill and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Garamundi for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm the proud co-sponsor of 6175 by Mr. Hunter. I urge members to support this important marine safety legislation. The tragic sinking of the U.S. flag commercial vessel SS El Faro was a sobering event. The loss of life and the exhaustive investigation that revealed significant safety deficiencies in both the vessels and in those individuals charged with its safe operation should be motivation enough for us to enact this purposeful reforms. I want to thank the chairman, Mr. Hunter, for conducting the necessary hearings and for this bill. This bill developed in consultation with the Coast Guard, the National Transportation Safety Board, Tote Marine, and other U.S. flag carriers, the U.S. Maritime Unions, and the American Bureau of Shipping. The bill will enact several recommendations contained in Admiral Paul Zumkoff's action memo in response to the Marine Board of Investigation report. The bill will improve survival and locating equipment requirements, including the use of distress signaling and location technologies, such as personal emergency beacons or strobes, to improve the odds that the Coast Guard can find mariners that are adrift at sea. In addition, the bill also requires the GAO to conduct an audit regarding the implementation of effectiveness of vessel safety management plans required under Chapter 32, Title 46 of the U.S. Codes. Coast Guard will also be required to issue flag state guidance for all freight vessels built before January 1992 regarding the inclusion of comprehensive damage control information in their management plans. I've often said that the Coast Guard budget is insufficient to meet its mission needs. The Coast Guard will not do more with less. The Coast Guard is, in fact, doing less with less. According to the Marine Board of Investigation report, we now know that the Coast Guard's internal marine safety and inspection functions was one of those missions that did less with less. This legislation requires the Coast Guard to rebuild its internal marine safety competency through better training of prospective sector commanders and journeyman inspectors, and the development of a staffing plan to bring on more inspectors. Inevitably, this will bring to us the necessity to adequately fund the Coast Guard. Moreover, the bill strengthens oversight of recognized organizations that conduct marine safety inspections, including the required completion and quality assurance audit by the Coast Guard. In closing, the bill strikes an appropriate balance between what the Coast Guard can do administratively, what the Coast Guard needs to do within the International Maritime Organization, and what new authorities and direction the Coast Guard needs to provide. Nevertheless, we should recognize this bill for what it is, a very positive step forward on what will be a long path to restore confidence in the marine safety functions of the Coast Guard. I want to thank the Chairman, Hunter, for putting together a very good bill that will significantly improve maritime safety and hopefully avoid another El Faro someday in the future. Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I recognize Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe this was a preventable disaster. The 33 members of that crew did not die. Obviously, in part, according to the investigation, the captain was at fault for, ignoring the intensity of the storm and the course that he chose. So that was obviously a major factor. There was poor bridge management. There were also substantial deficiencies in the safety management system and safety culture of the El Faro zone, Tote Marine. And then I think the greatest concern I have is the investigators' conclusion that the Coast Guard itself and third-party recognized organization that conducted marine safety inspections at El Faro were each at fault for not doing a better job of ensuring compliance with Coast Guard marine safety requirements. I have concerns about the conflicts with these certification societies. You're out there in the free market, you want to sell your services. I guess maybe you don't want to be too tough on people, but you know, that's not the way this should work. So we need more oversight of those certification authorities, maybe more, maybe some liability or fiscal responsibility in the future when it's noted that they passed a ship that shouldn't have been passed for numerous reasons. So this bill makes a number of corrective provisions to both address the findings of the Coast Guard and the NTSB and the action memo from former Commandant Zumkoff. And in particular, it shows that the Coast Guard Marine Safety Office needs to develop a new staffing plan and better bolster training for Coast Guard inspectors. So since much of this is being done by third parties, they need to be able to do much stronger oversight of those through the Coast Guard's alternate compliance program. And I particularly support the creation of a specific oversight office within the Coast Guard to make sure that any inspection conducted by a third party is complete, objective, and not tainted by conflict of interest or remuneration. So in closing, passing this legislation, it will be helpful. I don't believe it's the end of our work. I believe we're at the beginning of what will be a multi-year commitment by this committee to ensure the reforms in this bill are adopted, implemented fully, and that the Coast Guard remains committed to rebuilding its marine safety competence expertise. You know, maritime families that send their loved ones to sea, I represent half of the Oregon coast, including family members of the crew of the El Faro, should expect nothing less from us or from the Coast Guard. Again, I commend the sponsors of this legislation for their initiative, and I urge all members to support this legislation.
I thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to be heard? We will now consider the bill for amendment. Seeing none, I now recognize Mr. Hunter for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 6175 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6206, the Coast Guard Blue Technology Center of Expertise Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, call up H.R. 6206, and that be considered as read and open amendment at any time. Without objection, so ordered. H.R. 6206 will provide a necessary venue for Coast Guard to learn more about and keep up with the newly developing blue technologies. The bill is about the Coast Guard using innovation and modernization to support its mission. I urge all members to support. I now recognize Subcommittee Chairman to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's tough to move on from something as devastating and sincere as the El Faro loss and move on to a different piece of legislation that's not as important, but important to the Coast Guard. The Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Navy, they all have expos every year where civilians come in, technology people come in, and they say, here's what we have to offer you. Here's what the rest of the world that doesn't move at the speed of government has to offer you. The Coast Guard doesn't do that. 6 years ago when I started on the subcommittee chairing it, they have sensors now in the water. You can put surfboards in the water with sensors. Unmanned surfboards that can see if there's oil in the water, they can see if there's boats going past. The Coast Guard called these floating debris. Their lawyers didn't even have a name for what you call an unmanned vehicle in the water. They didn't know what to call it. The point is the Coast Guard needs to get out and talk to people that are in technology, that are in the world, and that's what this does. This legislation, the Coast Guard Blue Technology Center of Expertise Act, which is actually this bill was done by Mr. Garamundi, is a product of an ongoing interest, and the ranking member and I have in blue technology. The subcommittee held a hearing in May where the Coast Guard and industry representatives discussed existing and emerging technologies that could be used to assist the Coast Guard in performing its missions. This legislation is important for the Coast Guard. The service is currently recapitalizing its fleet of cutters. The new vessels will be faster and have a broader geographic range than the vessels they are replacing. However, the cutters and service members cannot be everywhere in the vast U.S. exclusive economic zone. Technology can assist the Coast Guard in covering a wider geographic area when performing its multitude of missions. Similar to the other armed forces, the service used to hold industry expos to learn about emerging technologies until limited budgets forced tough decisions and the Coast Guard stopped holding expos. That's like a company that's going down, canceling all of its marketing and commercials. Doesn't make sense. It just gets worse and worse and worse till you're no longer a company. The Coast Guard does review technologies through its research and development program. However, that process may not encompass all of what is being developed by industry, and industry may not know how to initiate contact with the Coast Guard's programs. This legislation will offer the Coast Guard further insight regarding the world of technology development to allow them to access so-called blue technologies while facilitating open dialogue with industry to ensure they understand Coast Guard acquisition policies and procedures. This bill is simply a way to assist the Coast Guard in being aware of and potentially acquiring emerging blue technologies. I urge members to support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Now I recognize Mr. Garamundi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. Over the past 5 years, while I've had the privilege of serving as ranking Democratic member of the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Committee, I've sat through numerous hearings on Coast Guard matters, such as acquisition policy, recapitalization, polar icebreakers, operational readiness, and mission performance. The hearing convened by Chairman Hunter in early May to discuss blue technology and the potential application to the Coast Guard operations hit home the message that we've seen all along. The Coast Guard has missed the boat and the opportunities when it comes to maximizing the effectiveness through the use of new technologies. Unlike the Navy, a wide variety of ocean industries and the ocean science community, the Coast Guard has not embraced the adoption and the use of these technologies, systems, sensors, and platforms. The hearing exposed a real missed opportunity for the Coast Guard. Moreover, at a time when the agency's budget is stretched thin, blue technologies, such as unmanned underwater vehicles or autonomous underwater vehicles, could enhance the Coast Guard's maritime domain awareness capabilities at a fraction of the cost of conventional assets, as in ships. My bill simply draws from the existing authority to direct the Coast Guard to establish a Blue Technology Center of Expertise. The overarching goal is to improve from within the Coast Guard's awareness of blue technologies that apply or align with the Coast Guard's mission needs. In addition, this new Blue Technology Center will facilitate a dialogue, sharing of information between the Coast Guard and a growing number of blue technology stakeholders and businesses drawn from the private sector, academia, and the ocean research community. Equally important, this new center will also provide opportunities for education and training of present and future Coast Guard personnel, who, after all, are going to have to regulate the growing use of blue technologies in the marine environment. In closing, the Blue Technology Center, established by this legislation, affords the Coast Guard a new opportunity to understand the potential of blue technologies and ensure that the Coast Guard remains semper paratus, or always ready, in the 21st century. I urge members to support this non-controversial legislation.
I thank the gentleman.
Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Do any of the members wish to be recognized? We will now consider the bill for amendment. Seeing none, I now recognize Chairman Hunter for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 6206 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. And the motion is agreed. The bill is approved and ordered favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is S-756, the Save Our Seas Act of 2017. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, call up S-756, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It is my understanding that the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. Without objection, we will call up that amendment in the nature of a substitute, and then we will give one statement on both the ANS and the underlying bill. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1 offered by Mr. Hunter.
S-756, the Save Our Sea Act, was sponsored by Senator Sullivan, and Congressman Don Young is the sponsor of the House companion bill. Key components of the bill include authority to respond to severe maritime debris events and further delineation of federal and non-federal cost-share provisions, authority to support research and development that reduces waste entering the ocean, and to work with foreign countries that lack infrastructure to stop waste from entering the ocean. The amendment preserves the purpose and intent of the Senate bill to reduce sources of maritime debris and to work with countries that have waste entering the ocean and to address severe maritime debris events. I urge all members to support the amendment. I now recognize Chairman Hunter to explain the bill and the ANS.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is pretty simple. When we had the tsunami, when Japan had a tsunami, Japan gave us $5 million because of debris washing up on the Pacific coast and in Hawaii. They gave us money, and we had to make an exemption, an exception for them so that the local communities didn't have to match the $5 million that the Japanese gave us. So we're fixing that. If there's a big spill, if something bad happens, this means that any entity, meaning Bill Gates or Japan, can give the United States $3 million or $20 million, and the local community, wherever it's at, doesn't have to match that. We're allowing that to happen. Marine debris is a persistent and pervasive issue, with much of the debris remaining in the ocean for years and impacting the ocean environment. And very rare that the Senate does anything, but it's nice to have one Senate bill here today. S-756, the Save Our Seas Act, does not solve the issue, but it continues to focus on the growing problem. It urges support for the research and development of systems and materials to lessen the amount and impact of waste in the ocean, and the President is urged to work with other nations to install or improve waste infrastructure. The bill also allows the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to determine and address severe marine debris events. Grants for severe marine debris events can be funded 100% by federal funds when a non-federal entity, including a foreign government, has wholly provided those funds. This bill is another step forward in combating marine debris. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for statement.
The chairman has once again produced a good piece of legislation. I urge its passage.
We will now consider the bill for amendment. Are there any amendments in the amendment of nature of a substitute? The chairman recognizes Mr. Nolan.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk asking unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
I would like to...
Gentlemen, suspend.
Amendment number 110 offered by Mr. Nolan.
Mr. Nolan is recognized to speak on his amendment to the ANS.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Chairman, Schuster, and Ranking Member DeFazio for all the important legislation you brought forth here today and all the great work that you have done in leading this committee, keeping with its great tradition. I also want to thank Mr. Hunter and Mr. Garamendi for their work on this important piece of legislation. My amendment is merely a sense of the Congress supporting a critical program administered by the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration in the Great Lakes. It does not create a new program nor authorize any expenditures for existing program. It's merely intended to express support and promote awareness of an important program as it relates to the Great Lakes, the Marine Debris Program. More specifically, the Great Lakes Land-Based Marine Debris Action Plan. And in that regard, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of Chairman Hunter, as well as Mr. Young earlier in the meeting about the great concern that is out there, and rightfully so, with regard to debris pollution of our oceans, as well as of our Great Lakes. And remind everyone once again, there's this area out in the Pacific that is the size of, twice the size of the great state of Texas. And that's the visible debris. That's not the microplastics that even have people throughout the Great Lakes region deeply concerned because it's polluting our Great Lakes beer. God forbid something like that should have to happen. The Great Lakes-based Marine Debris Action Plan was finalized in 2014 to establish a comprehensive strategic framework for actions to protect the Great Lakes, in addition to, of course, the work they're doing in the oceans, but the Great Lakes shorelines, people, wildlife from the terribly destructive effects of marine debris, including plastics, microplastics, abandoned vessels, and other harmful pollutants. Since 2014, NOAA has developed 53 actions that will be completed by 2019, of which 29 have begun and 75 have been successfully completed. These actions include comprehensive testing, water and shore cleanup, education awareness campaigns, public and private engagement, and recommending further actions to assure that our water in the Great Lakes is clear of harmful debris. The fact is, pollution in our waters is a national crisis, especially plastics and microplastics. Just recently, it was reported that a whale had washed up on a shore, and examiners discovered 80 plastic bags in the stomach. That's heartbreaking. In the Great Lakes alone, there are 10,000 tons of plastic in the water, and 80% of the litter on the Great Lakes shorelines comprises of plastics. The fact is, plastic pollution enters through the food chain, threatens the survival of our marine and plant lives, and is also harmful to human health. Additionally, plastics cause harm to boating, fishing, other recreational tourism activities, damaging our shipping and navigation economy. Ultimately, the Great Lakes Land-Based Marine Debris Action Plan does not get enough public support and attention for its incredibly good work that it is doing. And that is why I'm offering this amendment today. I'm committed to and look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that Congress further protects our lakes, our waters, our oceans, our Great Lakes from harmful pollutants like plastics from getting into our precious waters. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to be recognized on the amendment to the ANS? If not, the question is on the amendment to the ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Excuse me. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? If not, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Hunter for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that S 756 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
The motion is, or the question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended, is approved, and ordered, reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 3906, the Innovation Stormwater and Infrastructure Act of 2017. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment and call up H.R. 3906 that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It is my understanding that the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. Without objection, we will call up the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and then we will give one statement on both the ANS and the underlying bill. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1 offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana.
I want to thank Ranking Member DeFazio and Napolitano and Subcommittee Chairman Grace for their work on this issue. Stormwater runoff from streets and sewers can flow into rivers and be a major source of pollution. In addition, communities across the country face difficulty in funding projects to mitigate stormwater pollution, including many in my home state of Pennsylvania. Today's bill will assist communities in reducing their stormwater pollution and improve our nation's water quality. I encourage all members to support the amendment. I now recognize Chairman Graves to explain the bill and the ANS.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you. I want to thank Congressman DeFazio, Congressman Napolitano, and all the folks that helped get this to a posture where it's a bipartisan agreement. The amendment would direct the EPA to establish a stormwater infrastructure funding task force. And as we've discussed in this committee and many other areas, there are multiple funding streams that are out there, and we need to make sure we're looking at how to best manage and improve the availability of public and private funds to ultimately achieve our goal of better stormwater infrastructure. So the amendment allows EPA to work with communities across the nation and provide information on these various funding streams. I am pleased we could come to a bipartisan agreement on this, and I also want to make note from a home perspective. Our home state of Louisiana, we drain from Montana to New York and 2 Canadian provinces. So all of this water, when it comes down, ends up coming down through Louisiana and has an impact on our state. And I think it's really important that, that we do move forward with this, do a better job managing the various and disparate funding streams. I urge all members of the committee to support the amendment in the underlying bill. And I'd also like to ask unanimous consent that a support letter from the Water Environment Federation be included in the record. Yield back.
Now recognize Mr. DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill was originated by Denny Heck from Washington State. I've been up there and discussed the critical issues they have regarding Puget Sound, particularly lower Puget Sound. They made me an honorary member of the Puget Sound caucus, so I'm enthusiastically supporting this bill. But this is not a problem that is unique to Puget Sound. And it's happening in many areas around the United States. And the federal government really does need to do more to help communities come in compliance with the goals of the Clean Water Act. We need to encourage the implementation of cost-effective, low-impact development, nature-based infrastructure alternatives wherever possible. And we need to provide some federal assistance to communities to help them address their local challenges. This bill will, hopefully move us in that direction with a new task force that will look at funding affordability related to construction, rehabilitation, operation, maintenance of stormwater infrastructure necessary to meet the goals of the Clean Water Act. I think this is something that virtually every American would support, and as we are struggling more and more with water quality and runoff, this will help to begin to address that issue. With that, I recommend the bill to my colleagues.
I thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. Are there any amendments in the to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If not, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Graves for a motion. Be approved and reported favorably to the House. Is that what you're trying to say? The question's on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The bill is amended and approved in order reported favorably to the House. I ask for unanimous consent that each bill order reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask for unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bills to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 Ketco point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the committee authorize the chairman or his designee to offer such motions as may be necessary to the House to go to conference with the Senate on H.R. 66 as amended, H.R. 6194 as amended, H.R. 5846 as amended, H.R. 5772, H.R. 363460 as amended, H.R. 6175, H.R. 6206, S. 756 as amendment, and H.R. 3906 as amendment. Order reported by the committee today or similar Senate bills without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules of the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of a quorum for the actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business for the day, and the committee is adjourned.